In 1986, OSHA issued the interim final rule for hazardous waste operations and emergency response. 4 years later, this Hazwoper rule was finalized. It affects workers at hazardous waste treatment, storage, and disposal facilities, hazardous waste cleanup operations, and emergency response operations involving hazardous materials. The purpose of this presentation is to help you understand the Hazwoper regulation, your rights and responsibilities as a worker in this industry, and how to work safely around hazardous substances. Let's start with a basic question. What makes a substance hazardous? There is no simple answer. We need to look at several sources of information to get a complete definition. In OSHA's Hazard Communication Standard, a hazardous chemical is defined as any chemical which is either a physical hazard or a health hazard. According to OSHA, physical hazards include combustibles, flammables, explosives, oxidizers, organic peroxides, reactive chemicals, and compressed gases. Health hazards include sensitizers, irritants, corrosives, toxic and highly toxic agents, and carcinogens. The U.S. Department of Transportation lists the materials it considers hazardous in its hazardous material table in 49 CFR 172.101. According to DOT, a hazardous material is basically any substance which could present an unreasonable risk to health, safety, or property when transported. Finally, the EPA defines hazardous waste as any discarded material which is ignitable, corrosive, reactive, or toxic. The easiest way to tell if a particular substance is hazardous is to look right on the container label. There are several different labeling systems, but under OSHA, DOT, and EPA guidelines, all hazardous materials must bear warnings of the hazards they present. More detailed hazard information and handling instructions can be found on a hazardous materials shipping papers and other written documentation. When working with a hazardous chemical, you can look at its Material Safety Data Sheet, or MSDS, for information on hazards and safety precautions. Sometimes, however, this documentation is not available. Other times, we can encounter materials without container labels, or even without containers. In these situations, we need to use air monitoring to detect what Hazwoper calls IDLH conditions, conditions which are immediately dangerous to life and health. Laboratory analysis of contaminated air or samples of the material itself can confirm any IDLH conditions and provide more detailed information about the other safety and health hazards the substance may present. Once we are armed with this information, we can determine which controls and practices we need to use to minimize these hazards. This is the goal of the Hazwoper regulation. In accordance with Hazwoper, your operation has a site safety and health plan, which is designed to identify, evaluate, and control hazards. This written plan includes information about your operation's organizational structure, safety and health training program, medical surveillance, standard operating procedures, as well as descriptions of the specific tasks being performed on site. Your operation also has a written emergency response plan, which includes instructions on how to report and handle emergencies at your site. The Hazwoper standard also has specific training requirements for workers who could be exposed to hazardous materials on the job, as well as for their supervisors and managers. This training includes the identification of the specific safety, health, and other hazards on site. It also details the engineering controls, work practices, and personal protective equipment that are needed to combat those hazards. The amount of training you need depends on the type of work you will be doing. If you are involved in the removal of hazardous substances or in other activities that could expose you to these substances, you need a minimum of 40 hours of classroom instruction and no less than 3 days of field training. If you will only be on site occasionally to perform specific limited tasks, such as surveying or taking air samples, and you are unlikely to be exposed to hazardous materials above their published exposure limits, you need a minimum of 24 hours of classroom instruction and no less than 1 day of field experience. The same 24-hour training requirements hold true if you work in areas where exposures are lower than published exposure limits, respirators aren't necessary, no health hazards are present, and emergencies involving hazardous materials cannot occur. While these guidelines represent the minimum amount of training which is required, you may actually receive more. On the other hand, you may get less training if you already have work experience, academic coursework, or other hazardous materials training, which is equivalent to some of the training required by Hazwoper. Either way, you would still receive site-specific training about the hazards of your operation before beginning work. At least once a year, you will also receive 8 hours of refresher training. This will be a basic review of your initial Hazwoper training. It may also include a critique of any recent emergency incidents that illustrate the types of situations you could face. Under Hazwoper, hazardous waste sites must be evaluated to identify specific hazards and to determine what safety and health control procedures should be used at the site. This begins with a preliminary evaluation to determine what precautions need to be taken in order to do a more thorough site characterization. IDLH conditions are the focus of the preliminary evaluation, along with any other conditions which could cause death or serious illness or injury. These include confined spaces, visible vapor clouds, and potentially flammable or explosive situations. Once these immediate hazards have been dealt with, site characterization can continue. At this stage, all of the potential safety and health hazards will be thoroughly explored and analyzed. The end result of site characterization is the development of a site control program.
You're wearing a level B protection.
The site control program is a part of your operation's written safety and health plan. It includes a site map displaying work zones, as well as guidelines for using the buddy system to help prevent exposures, communications procedures, including how to report emergencies, standard operating procedures, safe work practices, and sources of medical assistance. Monitoring plays a major role in preliminary evaluations, site characterizations, and ongoing activities at your site. It is the primary means of identifying and measuring levels of hazardous substances, which is vital in determining the controls and practices that should be used at the site. During the preliminary evaluation, the goal of monitoring is to identify conditions which are immediately dangerous to life or health, IDLH, airborne contaminant levels over a substance's published exposure limit, and radiation levels over a radioactive material's dose limit. Monitoring is also used to identify other dangerous conditions, such as flammable atmospheres and oxygen-rich or oxygen-deficient environments. Depending on the conditions at your worksite, monitoring could be ongoing or just done periodically. Monitoring will continue as long as exposure levels have the potential to rise above published exposure limits. It must also continue if flammable atmospheres or other dangerous conditions could possibly develop. Monitoring will definitely be done whenever a new type of activity starts, new or unidentified substances are involved, or work begins on another part of the site. Situations which present a high risk of exposure to hazardous substances also require monitoring. This includes handling leaking drums or containers, or working in areas with obvious liquid contamination, such as a spill or contaminated water. Since many of our jobs present serious health hazards, Hazwoper may also require that you participate in your operation's medical surveillance program to help protect you from the effects of exposure to hazardous substances. You will participate in this program if, over a 12-month period, you spend 30 days or more wearing a respirator or working in an environment where there is the potential for exposure above published limits, whether or not a respirator is worn. Medical surveillance is also required if you are a member of a hazmat emergency response team, or if you ever develop symptoms which could be caused by exposure to hazardous substances. Medical surveillance includes an initial examination prior to starting work. The exam will be used to determine if you have any conditions which might affect your ability to work safely around hazardous substances. It will also provide a baseline for comparison with additional examinations you will have at least once every 24 months. OSHA recommends that these periodic exams be given every 12 months. You will also need to have an examination if you are accidentally exposed to a hazardous substance above its published exposure limits, display symptoms of overexposure, or are injured on the job, even if the injury doesn't involve a hazardous material. Medical examinations will be conducted by or under the supervision of a licensed physician. Medical tests, such as X-rays or blood screening, may also be a part of the medical surveillance program if the doctor feels they are necessary. Medical exams and tests will be scheduled at a reasonable time and location and will be provided at no cost to you.
Best of luck. All right, thanks on the new job.
Based on the results of the medical exams and tests, your doctor will determine if you have any conditions which would put you at increased risk from work involving hazardous waste, or would cause problems if you had to wear a respirator. The doctor will then provide your employer with a written opinion, which will include any limitations on your work activity that the doctor recommends. However, this written opinion will not discuss any medical findings unrelated to your job. These are strictly confidential. Your employer will provide you with a copy of the doctor's written opinion for your own records.
First sheet is a summary of the whole thing. They like it.
There is more to Hazwoper than medical surveillance, monitoring, and training. The regulation also calls for a system of controls to prevent overexposure to hazardous substances. This includes the use of engineering controls, safe work practices, and personal protective equipment. Engineering controls are devices designed to prevent or reduce your exposure to hazards. When working around hazardous waste, this can include pressurized cabs on material handling equipment and ventilation systems used to remove contaminated air from work areas. Work practices are policies, procedures, and actions which can reduce or prevent your exposure to hazardous waste. Examples include having non-essential personnel leave areas of potential exposure, staying upwind of possible airborne hazards, and wetting down dusty operations. Using safe work practices includes following standard operating procedures. These are the methods for performing specific tasks at your site or in your facility which have been approved by your supervisor, manager, or safety director.
And I do suggest that you read it.
The Hazwoper regulation provides standard operating procedures for working with drums and other containers, since safe handling is a vital part of minimizing exposure to contaminants. Government agencies, such as the DOT, OSHA, and the EPA, have specific physical requirements for containers used to store and transport hazardous substances. You need to make sure that drums and other containers meet these guidelines, and remember to inspect them for integrity before, during, and after use. Containers used for hazardous substances must be properly labeled as well. You should treat unlabeled drums and containers as if they contain hazardous materials until it has been determined otherwise. If sealed containers need to be opened for any reason, special precautions must be taken. These include having unnecessary personnel leave the area, using explosion-proof barriers and non-sparking equipment, and safely bleeding off excess pressure within the container before opening it. Drums and other containers of hazardous waste should be moved as little as possible. However, when it is necessary to transport containers, remember that radioactive, flammable, and shock-sensitive materials require special safety measures, such as the use of handling equipment with protective shielding. Do not move containers that seem to be bulging or swelling from excess pressure until the cause of the pressure can be determined and appropriate precautions can be taken. Ask your supervisor about the specific procedures that are used at your location. Prior to shipping, hazardous waste containers must be identified and classified in a staging area. This is the best way to make sure everyone knows what they are dealing with and how to handle it safely. If the combination of engineering controls and work practices cannot reduce your exposure to acceptable levels, then personal protective equipment must also be used. Remember, PPE is not meant to be a standalone solution. It should be used in conjunction with other controls to provide adequate protection. The personal protective equipment that you wear must always match the potential hazards of the work environment. There are 4 basic levels of PPE, each providing a different degree of protection. Level D provides only basic protection in the form of a standard work uniform or generic work clothing. Level C protection is used when the concentrations and types of airborne contaminants are known and are within acceptable limits for using full-face or half-mask air purifying respirators. Hooded chemical-resistant clothing is used at this level to provide protection against skin contact hazards, as well as to simplify decontamination. Level B PPE provides the same amount of skin protection as Level C, but a much higher degree of respiratory protection. This includes a full facepiece self-contained breathing apparatus, SCBA, or a supplied air respirator, SAR. Level A provides the greatest degree of skin, respiratory, and eye protection. This includes an SCBA or an SAR, plus a totally encapsulating chemical protective suit, along with other appropriate gear and clothing. While chemical protective clothing and PPE protects you from exposure to hazardous substances, it usually becomes contaminated in the process. Your clothing, PPE, tools, and equipment, even you, must be decontaminated whenever you leave a contaminated area. Decontamination is important to protect both you and everyone else you come into contact with, including your family and friends. The facilities and supplies you need for decontamination will be provided by your company. Personal protective equipment and tools must be treated appropriately, and clothing must be laundered or properly disposed of. If hazardous material can pass through your work clothing, or you are exposed during decontamination, you must shower to remove any of the material which may have come into contact with your body. Equipment and solvents used during decontamination will also become contaminated in the process. They must be decontaminated and disposed of as well. So far, we have talked mainly about hazardous waste operations. But Hazwoper also has requirements for emergency response to incidents involving hazardous materials. These requirements begin with a written emergency response plan, which provides instructions on how to report and handle emergencies at your location. The plan includes information on the roles of personnel participating in a response, lines of authority, methods of communication, and training requirements. Your operations emergency response plan also includes information on emergency recognition and prevention, site security and evacuation procedures, as well as decontamination procedures, first aid, and emergency medical treatment. Training plays an important role in emergency response. Hazwoper specifies 5 levels of training, depending on the role you might be expected to take in a hazardous materials incident. The first responder awareness level is for workers who are likely to witness a leak, spill, or other accidental release of a hazardous substance. If you fall into this category, you will be trained on the proper reporting procedures to use to initiate an emergency response.
It's glycol ether.
The first responder operations level is for workers who will be called upon to contain the release from a safe distance. People involved in operations level activities must undergo a minimum of 8 hours of emergency response training. The next level of training is for hazardous materials technicians, workers who will approach the point of release of a hazardous substance and plug, patch, or otherwise stop the release. Hazmat technicians must undergo a minimum of 24 hours of training. A hazardous materials specialist gets the same level of training as a hazmat technician, but receives more detailed training about the substances on site. Hazmat specialists may also be called upon to act as site liaison with federal, state, local, or other government authorities. The individual with the most authority in an emergency response situation is the incident commander. This person goes through a great deal of additional training to be prepared to take control of the incident scene and coordinate the entire emergency response.
It's a minor skin hazard.
No matter which role you take during an incident, it is important to be familiar with your operation's emergency response plan. Remember, this written program is the key to determining how to safely handle hazmat incidents at your site or facility.
The first thing we need to do is make the contact. If there's any spill, we need to
Hazardous waste can present immediate dangers to life and health, as well as long-term health problems. On Superfund cleanup sites, at hazardous waste treatment, storage, or disposal facilities, and in emergency response situations. That's why OSHA created Hazwoper, the Hazardous Waste Operations and Emergency Response Regulation, so you can get the information, training, and equipment you need to work safely around hazardous materials.